Welcome back to the CSS Grid course. I'm Zach, and this is part of my full stack roadmap series, which takes you from never having written a line of code to deploying a full stack e-commerce web app with React. For more information about that series, check the description below or this video up here. Anyways, continuing on with our discussion about CSS Grid, we have learned the basic tenets of CSS Grid, why we need it, and how to explicitly define the grid that we want to work with. So we have this 8x8 grid down here in the bottom right corner of our Firefox DevTools. And our next challenge is to figure out how do we take each of these grid items and place them on different parts of this grid. We can do this with the grid row start, grid row end, grid column start, and grid column end CSS properties. We'll start with the rows. So let's say that we wanted to put this first item down one, the second one we'll put it second to bottom, and the third one we'll put it at the very bottom. In order to do that, we just come to the individual grid items. So now we're kind of flipping from a grid container level property to an item level property. So we're going to select grid item 1 and then 2 and 3. So we'll replace that with a 3 and then a 2. And we'll start with the rows. So we'll say grid row start. And in this case, we have our lines already defined for us using the Firefox DevTools. So really helpful tool to have open. And we want to put this first one in this little sector for the row. So we want to start it at line number 2 and end it at line number 3. So we'll put in 2 there for the start, copy that down, and put end and replace that with 3. And now we have number 1 sitting down there in that spot. We said we wanted number 2 to be second from the end and 3 to be at the very end. So all we have to do is look at these row lines and place them there. So 2 will start at 7, end at 8, and 3 will start at 8 and end at 9. So we can just copy these grid row start and end properties down to these items. As you can see, they have already moved a little bit, but let's replace these and put it between 7 and 8, 8 and 9. So we've got our grid items on the rows that we want. Now we have to define which columns we want them in. So we'll keep the first one here. We'll just leave it. And we can actually define that explicitly, even though it's already there. So we'll say grid column start is going to be 1 because we're starting at the first column here. And then grid column end is going to be 2 because it ends at column 2. Now for this one, let's say that we want second to last column, and then likewise with the bottom one, we'll go with the last column. So we can just copy these properties in again. So for number 2, it starts at column 7, ends at 8. So we'll replace those numbers. You can see that jumped over there. And then finally, the third item will be between 8 and 9. So now we have placed our grid items explicitly on our 8x8 grid. So you know how to place the items, but how do we size them? What if we wanted these to be larger or smaller? Well, there's really 2 ways that I can think of off the top of my head. The first one is just explicitly defining the width and height of those items. So this is nothing to do with grid. This is just basic CSS. Let's say we came down to grid item number 1 and we gave it a width of 200 pixels. You'll see that that extends out and our grid gets collapsed in a very weird way. And I don't want to get into this quite yet because we're just not there yet. So we're not going to use this width and height properties on our grid items. We're going to keep our grid intact, and we're going to use these row start, row end, column start, and column end properties to size our items. So what if we wanted to take this first item and make it the full width of this container, the grid container? All we have to do here is go to the columns, because we're talking about what column does it start and end at. And I'm going to start it at column 1, end it at the last column, which is column 9. So all I have to do is change the 2 to a 9, and this item is now the full width of our grid container. This starts to get fun once you realize how easy it is. So let's say we wanted number 2 to extend right up to that number 1. So we'll start it at row 3 and we'll end it at the same one, so 8. So we'll come down to grid item 2. It starts at 3 and ends at 8, and now that's going to extend up and push up against that final one. And then maybe we'll make number 3 3 little grid cells wide. So we will start it at column, looks like column 6, and end it at 9. So start it at 6, end it at 9, and now we have that extending out. Now here's where those negative numbers come in. I know they've been probably bothering a few of you. I know that I would have been bothered looking at these. But let's say that we have a grid and we don't really want to calculate, how many items are in the grid. And, for this grid item number 3, it starts at 6 and ends at 9. And that's just kind of hard to deal with in our heads, because it's just like these numbers are just kind of arbitrary, it seems like. So what we could do is, instead of saying it starts at 6, ends at 9, we could say we just want to start it at the very end of the grid, and we want to end it 3 units to the left of the end of the grid. So what we can do here is we can come to the grid column start, and instead of using 6 right here, we're kind of reversing everything. So now we're going from right to left. We're going to start it at -1, which means we're going to start it at the very end of that grid. And then we're going to end it at -4, and that's going to extend it into the same little section that we had before. So if we know our grid is 8 by 8, we always know that -1 is going to represent the end of a row or column, and then we can just backtrack and say how many little grid cells that we want it to be. The next thing we're going to cover, and this is really important, is something called a grid area, and the concept of giving a width and height to a grid item. Let's get rid of a few things here. I'm going to remove all the styles from all of these grid items. And then I'm also going to comment out those last 2 grid items. So now we just have 1 sitting in our grid. When it refreshes, and let's get that grid outline back. Now, if you remember what I said, when we give a width to grid item number 1 of 100 pixels, the whole grid is going to move. And that is because an individual grid cell is 37.5 pixels wide, and we're giving it 100 pixels wide, so it's kind of stretching outside of its predefined grid area. How do I know this dimension? Well, if you go to the console and you just type in 300 divided by 8, because there's 8 total grid items, wide and tall, you get 37.5. And you can even check that if you come back. Let me get rid of this for a second. I'll remove that explicit width off of this. So now we have this little normal sized item, and it's 37.5 by 37.5, as you can see highlighted there. Let's experiment around with this a little bit though. I think you'll start to understand it better once we get a bigger grid area to work with. So I want to fill up this entire space here. So I'll go to this grid down here. So starting in this little grid cell, going all the way down to here, so it'll be a 3 by 3 kind of grid area within our bigger grid. So to do that, we'll go to our lone grid item, and we'll say grid row start is going to be number 2. So we'll put in 2. Grid row end is going to be 5, I believe, so that we can get 3 units. And then the column is going to be just indented 1. So we'll start it at 2 and also end it at 5. So now we have a little square in here within our grid, and what we call this is the grid area. So this grid area is going to be 37.5 times 3, which I may want to change this actually. So 37.5 times 3 is 112.5. I don't really like that. Let's go with 4 so that we can get an even number of 150. So all we have to do is increase this 5 to a 6, and now it's going to get a little bit larger for us. So looking at this grid area, we can now resize our grid item and it can fit within that space a little bit better. So we know that this grid area is 150 by 150. And if we took our grid item and gave it a width of 100 pixels now, it's not going to change the grid itself because our new dimension is smaller than the grid area that we've defined for the item. Maybe we can also give it a height so that we're working with perfect squares in general here. And as you can see, within this grid, the grid area is defined by this perfect square, but then we've reduced the size of the grid item within it. Now, the next question that we have, the reason that I did this and showed this is because we have to talk about grid item alignment. This might be a little confusing because didn't we already talk about alignment? Like we were moving these grid items around, placing them all over the grid. Is that not alignment? Well, there's actually 2 additional types of alignment we can do with the grid. So the first one that we're about to cover is how are those grid items sitting within their grid areas? Once again, the grid area is going to be defined by these properties right here. And the grid area here is from row 2 to 6 and column 2 to 6 over here. So what we have is some empty space. So this entire, I'll try to highlight it on the screen, but we've got a bunch of empty space here around this grid item to fill up the total grid area. And we have a couple properties that will allow us to take that single grid item and move it around within its predefined grid area. What we're going to use to align this is a container level property or properties. So what we're going to be using is justify items, and we'll set that to its default of stretch. And that's going to actually, I believe, no, that does not change it quite yet. And then align items stretch. But if I change these from their defaults and I put in something like, we'll say center. Now this is pretty easy to understand. Center is, we use this with Flexbox a lot. And what you'll see is that it shrinks to fit the content of the grid item. Now before I get any further, you might be wondering, how did I know to put center in here? Well, there's the MDN documentation, and you can always come in and type your properties. So we'll say align items. We'll go to that page, and then it gives you all of the values that you can use. And of course, this particular property can be used on Flexbox and CSS Grid. So if you read further here, it kind of tells you what all of these possible values will do based on what display type you have. So the documentation will explain all of them. I'll try to walk you through some common ones, but just so you can kind of fend for yourself, that's where you would go. So anyways, when we do not have an explicit width or height set, and we put the justify items and align items in there and give it anything but its default. So if we comment these out, it's going to stretch to fit. If we comment them back in and put these to stretch, both of them, it's also going to fit because that's kind of the default value. But if we bring it to center, then it's going to shrink to the size of the content. Now what happens when we bring the width and the height back in? Once we do that, it will respect its width and height, and you can see that we have a 100 by 100 grid item that is centered within its grid area. Now we could also say we want to justify items, so this is going to be the horizontal alignment. We want that to be centered, but maybe we want the vertical alignment, the align items, to be at the end. So we just type end, and that's going to drop down to the base or the bottom of this grid area right here, and it's going to be centered horizontally. Let's make things a little bit interesting here. Right now we have one grid item. If we turn on the grid itself, it's defined by this grid area from 2 to 6, 2 to 6. Let's add another one in. So I'll come here and uncomment our second grid item. It's going to go up to the top left by default. It's going to turn our grid lines off. That's fine for a second. And I'm going to paste down the styles from grid item 1 into grid item 2. For now, I want to uncomment the width and height because I don't know exactly what I want yet. And if I enable the grid again and look here, maybe we want to put this in the bottom right and give it 2 by 2. So that would mean we'll just get creative here and we'll use those negative values. So maybe we want to start at the end and go back 2 spaces. So all we would need to do is say I want to start at the last row, and then I want to start at the last column, and then I want to come back 2 spaces, so that'll be -3. And there's our perfect little square in the bottom right corner. So now we have 2 grid items and 2 grid areas. The first grid item is 100 pixels wide and tall, and it's in the 2 to 6 grid area. The second one, let's go ahead and make the width and height properties, and we'll call them, I don't know, something like 50 pixels. And we know that setting 50 pixels is going to be just fine because we have each item is 37.5, and 37.5 times 2 is going to be 75? Yeah, 75. So in all, we have a 75 by 75 grid area down here. Now, we can go back up to our justify items and align items, and I'm going to, before I uncomment this, I will put this to center. So we should have these grid items centered within their grid areas, and what you should see is that both of them will do the same thing. So I'll uncomment this, and you'll see that they both center within their grid areas. And if I were to put this to end, you'll see that both of them are going to jump down. So what if you wanted to take one of them and center it, and then the other one you want to align in a different way? Well, that is where the justify self and align self properties come in. Rather than setting this on the container level, honestly, most of the times you probably would just do that. But we'll uncomment the justify items and align items, and we'll come down to each property itself, and we'll say justify self, which is going to go right to left alignment, and we'll set that to center. So you'll see this one jumps to the middle, and then align self will also set to center. So now that's going to be centered perfectly. But down here, this one has not moved because we only set that on the first item. So we can come down and copy these styles. Maybe we'll put them both at the end so that it's sitting perfectly in the bottom right corner of our container. So I'll just replace center with end. Do that the same down here, and now we have one that's at the bottom right corner of our grid container. Before I end this video, I'm just going to do a very rapid fire review of pretty much everything that we've covered. I'll try to knock this out in a minute or two. So let's start over. We've got 2 grid items, and the way that we are defining their grid areas is going to be with the grid row start, end, column start, and column end. Let's say that we wanted the grid area for this first one to go from the very top left corner all the way down to row 7 and column 7. Very easy. Just put a 1 as the start value and put a 7 as the end value, and now you've got that huge grid area. Now let's remove the width and the height, and you'll see that the content fits because we have justified self as center, but if we remove those, it's going to stretch to fill that whole grid area. Each little grid cell is going to be 37.5 pixels, so if we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cells, you would take that and say 6 times 37.5. This is 225 by 225. Let's set the grid item to 200 pixels to make it smaller than its grid. So we'll say width is 200 pixels, height is also 200 pixels. That's going to jump within the grid, but if we wanted to center that and do it at a global level, so let's remove these properties down here. Actually, we'll keep those. We'll set this at a global level with the justify items and align items, and maybe we want to center our grid items within their grid areas. This one is still sticking down here because the justify self and align self for the grid item level assignments are going to override that global level assignment at the container level. So that's what we're seeing right here. And backing up even further, how did we get this grid in the first place? Well, we used the grid template rows and grid template columns, and we said that we wanted 8 rows and we wanted 8 columns, each of them to take up 1 fractional unit. If you've got 8 fractional units, you take the total width and height of that container of 300 by 300, divide 300 by 8, that gives you 37.5. 1 fractional unit is 37.5. You want 8 of those, that's your grid. If you somewhat followed along with that quick little summary, then you're in good shape. The next video, we're going to be talking about another form of alignment, which is the grid level alignment. So what happens if our grid itself is smaller than the grid container? How do we align the entire grid? Also in the next video, we will do a basic little challenge to create a CSS grid from scratch. I will kind of give you a prompt and you can try to code along, solve it yourself, and then I'll walk you through it.